Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on telecommunication for development. This lecture is a part of your paper on development communication. This lecture will discuss the revolutionary developments in telecommunications and information technologies and its role in the development process. Even after the emergence of the alternative paradigm, the modernization paradigm and the diffusion theory never actually have faded out. Scholars opine that modernization and advancing technologies continue to influence the government plans and policies. Further, the developing technologies offer the scopes of modernization to the developing countries. Telecommunications were never considered as the mass media, and they had more often individualized identity, learning outcome. After this lecture, you will be able to understand the role of telecommunications in development and how this development is considered as revival for modernization. We'll also understand how the technology transfer had the power of reaching out to the isolated, marginalized villages, leading it towards modernization. Telecommunications and development. The end of the 20th century had witnessed the rapid and exponential growth of the telecommunication and the information communication technologies. We know that the conventional mass media technologies like television, radio, press are basically isolated, discrete technologies. However, the telecommunication technologies like the telephone remained secluded from the mass media. This relatively newer concept appeared more flexible and asynchronous. The telecommunications, being the carriers of information, offered the government the scopes of surveillance and power over the larger masses. The central purpose of communication in the context of development is to understand and achieve substantial goals. During the 1950s and 1960s, development theorists stressed that development could be achieved by urbanization and industrialization. Further, attempts like participatory approach and dialogic communication at a grassroots level suggested by the alternative paradigms were not met appropriately by the government. Only in few movements in the Asian and Latin American countries, modest attempts could be observed of putting the new theories into practice. Non-governmental organizations, social action groups, and other agencies headed these development movements with the usage of new theories. The institutions took initiative by promising a better life, both here and hereafter, and were subsequently followed by non-governmental organizations, foreign aid agencies, and academics who went to less developed regions to oversee projects, collect data, and formulate theories based on those data. The goal was to improve the lives of the inhabitants of the peripheral regions of the world, which have not undergone materialistic development as witnessed in the developed world. We have studied earlier that the modernization paradigm had its base in the Western developed theories, economic expansion and Cold War politics. It is interesting to note that the transition from the dominant to alternative paradigms have changed the perspectives of communication. This transformation demanded for a strong ideological force which had the potential to replace the old traditional behaviors, customs, culture, and practices with new values, beliefs, culture, industrial behavior, and attitudes which was characteristic of the Western world. The notion of information society attained massive popularity during the 1970s and 1980s. Unfortunately, a widening gap was created in between development theories and practice. Development communication, since its inception, has played an important role in dissemination of information among the masses for the purpose of the development, socially, politically, economically, and psychologically. The focus of development has always been growth. In the past decades, the evolution of telecommunications has made the revival of modernization paradigm once again in its theory as well as practice. Rural development is the focus of the government through the telecommunications. Telecommunications entered the field of development communication during the 1980s and primarily included not only the broadcast media but also the telephone and technological innovations like satellite communications and teleconferencing. Communication satellites and wireless technologies transformed the nature of mass communication. With the ingress of computer since the 1970s and 1980s, it was discrete yet interactive, and that concept changed the nature of communications. Convergence of different media with the telecommunication technologies made interactions possible across the world. It has made the dissemination of information easier and faster. What we have seen so far is that development communication is mainly concerned with the role of information and communication in economic and social development of an individual, society, or the nation. It determines what the mass media can do directly or indirectly to improve the quality of life of the people. Development scholars opined that communication can lead to the speedy transformation of a country and of its people from poverty to a dynamic state of economic growth that makes possible greater social equality and larger fulfillment of human potential. However, the concept of development initially was economic driven and has been borrowed from the West industrialized nations. No doubt, Soviet Russia also strived to spread its model of development vis-a-vis communism, but it lagged behind in the media dissemination of its development model, with consequently the United States taking a lead in spread of capitalist mode of development worldwide. Though the alternative paradigms have tried to offer explanations of the underdevelopment in Asian countries, and the remedies suggested were idealistic and non-compliant with the government interests. Though the progress was slow initially, but the underdeveloped countries did not lag behind after the introduction of telecommunications. These advancements actually made two-way communications possible between remote areas and larger rural communities. With these slow developments, various telecommunications experiments were launched in Asian countries like India, Indonesia, and other South Pacific regions. The evaluation of the results of these experiments proved that there is an integral link between rural development and strategic telecommunication systems. Further, in this context, scholars pointed out that telephones and other such technologies are a cause for development and not consequences of development. Thus, many of the developing nations collaboratively worked with Intelsat for providing a substantial percentage of domestic telephone communication through the satellite, as demonstrated by the studies of United States Department of State and United States Telecommunications Suppliers Association, telecommunications in developing countries. In the report by Maitland Commission, the development potential of telecommunications is mentioned. The Maitland Commission was formed by the International Telecommunications Union. This committee was formed to investigate the possibilities of telecommunications for better growth, especially in the third world. Telecommunications can help not only in economic activities but also in health and other related services. What is most important in an emergency situation is rapid communication and transfer of information, and telephones can provide the timely information as well as reducing the need to travel physically. The dramatic revolution of telecommunications happened at a time when its role was considered to be most significant. The modernization approach campaigned for transfer of technological infrastructure for development. So, Maitland Commission reports no development of any nation is complete without the intervention of telecommunications. It also added that telecommunications should be included in the fields of agriculture, roads, and other similar sectors for enhancing the lives of the people in marginalized areas. If we look in depth, then we can find the relevance of telecommunications in the prescriptions of alternative paradigm that advocated for self-reliance and self-development. Telecommunications can improve scopes for education channels that can contribute to increased literacy and self-reliance. In fact, education and training sector had been one sector that can benefit exponentially through telecommunications. After the report of the Maitland Commission, there have been other attempts as well for improvement of rural telecommunication services in the developing nations. Attempts for stimulating the growth of telecommunications, other experiments and studies were also undertaken, like the Telecommunication and Economic Development Study by the World Bank and Telecommunications for Development Study by ITU and OECD in the non-aligned countries. Further, the Center of Telecommunications Development was established in the year 1985. Besides, World Bank, ITU and OECD, there were other organizations too contributing to the assistance for improvement of telecommunications in developing nations. Some of the examples are International Programme for Communications Development (IPCD) by UNESCO, Inter-American Development Bank or IDB, and United States Agency for International Development or USAID, and many others. Hudson and Mayer's pioneering work provided a theoretical framework endorsing the role of telecommunications in development process of rural areas. The World Bank supported the development of several telecommunications setups in many developing countries by the mid-1960s. Studies have hypothesized about the possible role of telecommunications in the growth of rural areas. Since the 1960s, there have been mainly three types of studies of telecommunications in development. Firstly, the case studies of telecommunication projects, statistical studies for measuring the development progress through telecommunications, and lastly, non-empirical studies for measuring the influences of telecommunications. According to Hudson, though these studies point towards the relationship between development and role of telecommunication tools, but it does not actually clarify the question pertaining to the development goals of using telecommunications. Researchers also note that there is an interdependency factor between the investments in telecommunications and economic development. Hudson further proposes a revised public good theory in place of the objectives established by the modernization model of development. This theory would include the benefits for the larger society by reducing the costs of rural service delivery and increasing the prices of agricultural production returns for the farmers. It also hypothesized for endorsing an equal distribution of economic benefits among all sections and for improvement of quality of life of people by facilitating a social transformation process. There are limitations that cannot be overlooked, especially in developing nations, because of limited access to telephones and communication costs quite unaffordable for the poorer sections of the society. Telecommunications and development in India. As we noticed, development researchers have come out with frameworks suggesting how telecommunications can stimulate developments in developing non-aligned countries. What we need to understand is that all telecommunication and information technology tools, computers, may not be always appropriate to the prevalent conditions of the developing nations. Telecommunications are capital-intensive technologies, and excess usage of these tools by the developing nations might lead to heavy dependency on transnational power blocks and multinational corporations. It is a good thing that free exporting and enterprises in Asian nations have almost succeeded in matching up with the international industrial standards. What we understand here is that socio-economic situations of every country are different, that theories of development communication appear to be irrelevant in many cases. Each and every country tries to find out its own way of achieving development by retaining its traditional values. Interestingly, in India, the liberalization of telecommunications has led to the privatization of some public sector services. Before the liberalization of the computer industries in India, the government's policy facilitated self-realization strategy through substitution method. To support this strategy, the government established the Computer Maintenance Corporation (CMC) and Electronics Corporation of India (ECIL). The liberalization policies initiated in the mid-1980s by the Rajiv Gandhi government and again in the 1980s by the Narasimha Rao government encouraged joint ventures with transnational companies. So, from this discussion, what we understand is that the Indian government did not lag behind in the initiation of new advanced technologies like telecommunications. Time and again, even though its television was limited to urbanized areas and restricted users. The first sets of computer sets in the country were in between 1960s and 1970s. These decades also witnessed the appearance of several national players. The developments in telecommunications and the liberalization policies of the government had led to the speedy evolution of computer industry in the country. We have noticed that the Rajiv Gandhi government had basically started the information revolution in the country by opening up business doors for foreign stakeholders. Besides this particular factor, there were other reasons like lessening of import duties on computer technologies, gradual privatization of telecommunications, and advancement of information technologies. The Indian government in the year 1994 had announced a new telecommunication policy that opened avenues for private players. According to the new telecommunications policy, the private sectors were needed to include the marginalized communities in India in their operating zones for obtaining a license from the government. It is an undeniable fact that the era of satellite communication has introduced people to the transforming and modernized lifestyle habits and also affected their consumption behavior, though such an influence was limited to the section of people with sufficient disposable income. The vision behind the initiation of the information revolution and exploring the full potential of telecommunications was for developing a modern India capable of competing with the developed industrialized countries. The urbanized India was flooded by the information revolution and international brands of consumer goods, value-added services like the cable channels, paging, advanced computer software and hardware, etc. Unfortunately, the rural areas remained unaffected by such developments in the technological sector. What further strengthened such urban-centric approach was the restructuring of the economy, making it more liberalized and promoting foreign and private investments in the 1990s. Though there were strong reactions from the stern economists, marking this restructured approach by the government as a case of getting sold out to the multinationals. Another most striking development in the history of telecommunications in the country was the phenomenal growth of STD booths in distant areas. Operating licenses were freely given to the small-time operators by the Department of Telecommunications. The growth was remarkable, and by the mid-1998, there were around 20,000 STD booths in Maharashtra. Before the announcement of telecommunication policy, the liberalization of the services like video text and conferencing, paging, electronic mail, cellular telephony, etc. had been done in 1992. Primary objective of the telecommunications policy was to improve the communication scenario of rural villages in the country by providing increased telephone connections. Though the liberalization of the value-added services was an instant success in the urban areas, but the objectives of the setup of basic telephones in rural areas seemed distant in villages in states like Bihar and other northeastern states because of subordinate telecom circles. Private investors, including those who have won the bid for licenses, appeared reluctant to risk their capital. The government established the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, for observing the operation and services of the private sectors in the rural services. TRAI was founded in the year 1997. Besides monitoring the telecom services, its other objective was to sort out any dispute between the private players and the authority. Further, the integration of telecommunications with computing and mass media have brought about the innovative in the information and communication technologies. There were limitations as well. All the nodules of the telecommunications were situated in the urban areas, and qualities of telephone infrastructure were poor in village areas. The great assurance about the potential of telecommunications for development in developing nations appeared similar to movement of mass media of the 1950s and 1960s. Scholars presumed that exposure of the people to telecommunications in the Third World would bring immediate development. However, the most pertinent question at this stage is how effective would be influence of telecommunications in accelerating development in the absence of a concrete socio-economic and legal social structures. Implementation of proper technology planning is also equally important. Intermediary organizations can also play an important role in bridging the social benefaction gaps between different classes. Now, let us summarize. From this lecture, we learned that scholars have advocated for rural development by highlighting the uses and applications of telecommunications in the Third World countries. Telecommunications were initially developed in advanced societies for their interests of modernization. However, its expansion in the developing nations have been rapid and helped to network non-government organizations, social action groups in remotest of areas and help generate awareness about the basic health and education issues. Telecommunications was instrumental in bringing attention of the international investors towards the development of non-aligned countries. Various regulatory bodies were established by the government for ensuring smooth functioning of the telecommunication operators. Even with a substantial teledensity, that is, telephone per person, rural areas remained ill-served. Rural areas were also affected by low access and poorer economic conditions. Thus, for exploring the full potentials of telecommunication technologies in the rural areas, intermediate organizations can play a significant part. More research and analysis of the issues of remote areas is needed for deriving maximum benefits of telecommunications. Hope that you enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.